Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon again, and welcome back to the Monitoring and Modeling Cryospheric Change session, now part 3. So for those who joined for the first time now, my name is Homa Khairolapur, Assistant Prof at Laurier University, co-chairing this session with Dr. Marshall, who is not here right now. In this session, we have 2 oral presentations, and we have 15 minutes for discussion in between, and we can have discussion and ask questions about any other presentation in this session that we had from part 1, part 2, and part 3. For some housekeeping notes, so each oral presenter will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes for Q&A, and poster presenters that we don't have it today here in this session, so we can move on, that's okay. Just keep in mind, there are different poster discussion sessions going on today, tomorrow, and for the rest of the conference. Make sure you attend that, and you can have discussion with the poster presenters. For our audience, if you have questions, please raise your hands and speak up, or you can also use the chat function for writing your questions. That's all. Without further ado, so it's my pleasure to invite our first speaker, Robin Turn from Wilfrid Laurier University. We'll talk about recommendations to enhance hydrological model for improved estimates of climate impacts on northern waters. Rob, the floor is yours. Over to you, and take your time.
All right. Great, thanks so much, Homa. Okay, so just postdoc at Wilfrid Laurier, and Homa had already explained my title, so I'll just jump right into it. So changes in Arctic climate are having an impact on interactions between surface water, shallow subsurface water, lake stream flow, and permafrost. So as the climate changes and permafrost thaws, we're expected to see an enhancement of the spatial and temporal variability in the active layer thickness. Increase in currents and talics, subsidence of ground surface, and enhancement of the contribution of groundwater flow to stream flow with an increase in the conductivity. In cold regions, there are some key hydrological processes that are available there, not in the temperate areas usually. Well, there's a lot of overlap, but the key ones that really stick out are like the surface energy balance, snow processes, dynamics of soil thermal, so water moisture fluxes, soil heterogeneities, the dynamics of the active layer thickness, changes in the subsurface water connectivity, the ground surface subsidence, freeze-thaw processes, shrub growth, expansion, lake ice phenology, and river ice. But many of these processes are really small scale, and that's the important part of this. And some of these processes are actually non-trivial and highly complex. So we need to examine these processes in detail. So hydrological models, useful tools to investigate how warming and permafrost thaw will influence cold region hydrological processes, and in turn will help inform water resource and management decisions. They're often used with a sparse observational network in this complex region, but there's a lot of significant limitations in modeling, especially for incorporating a high degree of spatial variability that controls runoff. So the interaction between permafrost, groundwater, and stream flow needs improving, with models lacking sophisticated permafrost groundwater components. They're also limited in dynamics of the soil thermal and soil moisture fluxes, subsidence, and freeze-thaw processes. So this really requires the development and application of cryohydrogeological models. So these models, these cryohydrogeological models, are basically modeling groundwater in cold regions, and they model the supra and sub-permafrost groundwater. Recently, studies have focused on changes in the active layer thickness, lateral transfer of energy, and the groundwater discharge. They are limited in surface processes, particularly snow cover and vegetation, and they're usually applied at a small scale in ideal environmental conditions. With the objectives, there's been a few recent reviews of hydrological and cryohydrogeological models that can be used in permafrost environments. However, this project is a little bit different. We actually will examine the past hydrological model studies conducted within and around a long-term research watershed in Western Canadian Arctic, the Trail Valley Creek watershed, research watershed. This is in order to provide a review of model performance and advances. This project will determine the limitations and advances of select models and make some recommendations to enhance model development. This will help our understanding to model interaction between the surface and subsurface hydrology under conditions of thawing permafrost, and assess a wide range of future hydrological changes within this rapidly changing environment. So the Trail Valley Research Watershed covers approximately 57 square kilometers. It's located in ice-rich permafrost region. Within Trail Valley, there's a sub-basin, Sissick Creek, where a lot of studies have been done, which is an area just about under a kilometer square. This research watershed has a long-term observed climate hydrological data. And since it's been established in 1991, there's been an extensive number of research papers, many using a variety of hydrological models. As well, this site is within the Northern Water Futures Study domain. So modeling within Trail Valley, there's been different hydrological models over the years that were used in past studies. Just to name a list of them, actually, just ones like Class, Mesh, Watt Class, Topoflow, CRIM, GEOtop, and Cryogrid. So for my project here, or for this presentation, I'm just going to pick a few out of this long list, so just for time's sake. So first example is looking at snowmelt runoff. So this study done by Polback in 2005, basically where they modeled the spring runoff, snowmelt runoff at Trail Valley using Watt Class. They had moderate success in simulating meltwater runoff in shrub tundra areas. From their study, they recommended better understanding of complex influences on the shrub canopy with the surface energy balance. The models within the study were run at a 1 kilometer resolution, so try to include as much small scale variability as possible. Any smaller, that actually would have posed some challenges to their model assumptions. So in all, they suggested a better balance between the model resolution and their computer efficiency at the time of the study. So this leads into spatial discretization, which is basically the watershed divided into units for model simulations. So there's different types of how this watershed could be broken up into. So one approach is a grid base, which is ideal for coupling remotely sensed data. The large grid resolution, though, does have some limitations in representing the landscape variability and processes at smaller scales. And for these smaller scales, there's a high computational burden and large memory demands. Another approach would be just basically a sub-basin, sub-grid approach, using hydrological response units, for example. Basically irregularly shaped hydrologically uniform entities. They're limited with low variable elevation and macro scale basins, which a large amount of segmentation in these heterogeneous basins. And then another one I just want to touch on is TIN. So triangular irregular networks, the irregularly sized, non-overlapping connected triangles with each one of them representing a subbase. These are pretty useful for regions of high heterogeneity and can allow for both high resolution, and they're applicable for modeling over larger extents. But there's also an increase in the computational requirements due to the complexity. So going back to that slide again, so basically need to find an ideal approach for small scale processes within this region. A lot of other key components come in within this. It's such as depends on your hydrological process, the study area characteristics, the objectives of the project, available data, desired spatial resolution, computational resources, expertise of the user. Ideally, the model will allow for different spatial scales over large extents. And also, for example, while they're flexible, but they're also able to map areas of high heterogeneity with less points over areas of low relief. So another example I just want to bring in from modeling over Trail Valley with the GEOtop model. Now, this is a lot to do following the work with Quinton and Marsh. One of the studies done by Andresi back in 2010 used GEOtop to consider the surface energy balance of tundra and shrub tundra during the snowmelt, whereas another study about a year later used GEOtop to examine how the topography of ground surface in Sissick Creek influences the spatial variability and the depth of the active layer. So I just want to touch on that one a little bit more. But first, GEOtop. So it's a process-based cryohydrogeological model. It can simulate the snow accumulation and melt, saturated, unsaturated flow, overland flow, stream flow generation and routing, surface energy balances, and heat water energy, water budgets at and below the surface. It's mostly built to handle complex terrain and small catchments, but requires intensive data input, model parameters, field measurements, and intensive computational resources. So now back to their study, the GEOtop does include snow cover and effective vegetation cover, but for their work, they carried out numerical experiments without them. So they used high resolution modeling and considered the role of mineral earth hummocks and inner hummocks flow paths. They found that the measured and modeled saw depths compared reasonably well in warmer months. And they also found that the spatial patterns of the ground thaw were controlled by the spatial distribution of soil moisture, which was largely determined by the subsurface flow patterns. GEOtop is still being used today, and especially in our research group, with the work done by Brampton, which he discussed yesterday morning at the start of the session. And then for just a final example, it deals with Thermokarst lakes. So the Arctic is dominated by an immense number of these Thermokarst lakes, which are susceptible to rapid drainage. They could be a risk to people, infrastructure, fish habitat. Past studies have used models to examine this. So basically examine the processes associated with channel development after rapid lake drainage, and then processes leading to initiation of the drainage. However, they were unable to determine the specific causes of the actual rapid lake drainage within this area. So with modeling Thermokarst lakes, next generation models need to consider like lake ice phenology, lake evaporation, and lake levels, and also need to consider basins with a network of coupled lakes, the connectivity of lakes flow routing, and then of course the fill and spill concept, which is quite well used up in this area here. So recommendations, just to summarize the current recommendations from this project. One is just to develop, modify hydrological models to incorporate cryohydrogeological models and the lake model, lake modules. Basically, you can couple surface hydrological model for upward boundary conditions with a cryohydrogeological model. Another one's important to really include the small scale processes within hydrological models for permafrost environments. The model would be beneficial if it was open source or can be modified. If there's a flexible model structure, so you can model across a variety of spatial and temporal scales and processes in between processes. Limited to no model calibration required. And particularly for these days, with the available computational resources that we all have at our hands, means less computational limitations. So just to conclude, need to provide timely, accurate simulations to help improve our understanding of the interaction between surface and subsurface hydrology. Each hydrological model has their unique characteristics and limitations. Implementations or recommendations will help focus on permafrost thaw at critical spatial scales and help with analysis of key hydrological processes for this region. These next generation models will help address current future management challenges, will help evaluate amplitude impacts, and help predict changes in hydrological process in order to help develop future mitigation plans. Just want to thank you for that. And just want to mention the side group that our research group is actually looking for any PhD students, particularly for Canadian Space Agency projects and others for other related projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for the great presentation. It's great. So we have lots of time for questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand or use the chat function to ask the question. We can have more discussion on any other presentations that we had today. So please use the time to have a good discussion and / questions. So we have the first question in the chat, Rob, for Robin. Depending on how long these models are run for, how important is to have a model that can change the landscape? I assume that the Thermokarst lakes must have been changing with the changing climate.
Hi, Frank. Yeah, actually, it's very good. Yeah, with the changing landscape, it's actually really important to have one that can be modified with the land covers, especially with things that are being rapidly changed up in this environment. So for sensitive analysis and future changes and stuff like that, you can't just modify all the input data. You actually have to modify our land covers as well as things do change. And it's one of the hard things to predict, but we can actually go and, in future studies, when we start working on with the rapid drainage, even look at how if removing or modifying by either the rapid drainage or the infill combination of flakes together would have impact on this area and with the modeling results. So this is really quite important.
Great. Rob, for the area, like Trade Valley or NWT, that we have lots of small lakes, like lots of water bodies. How much you think ice on, ice off, or ice information freeze up breakup time is implemented in these models? And what are the limitations for this type of information?
Actually, from the models I worked with, or actually started to review and stuff, there really isn't, a lot of stuff with the Climo and all that. It's not really handled all too well right now. But that's the key thing is the need for actually doing more lake dynamics in this region that's mostly covered in lakes is quite important. So that's one of the aspects we're going to look into is incorporating more lakes within the land cover scheme and the processes too, because it's a huge impact on these regions, especially in the shoulder seasons. So, and it's, definitely something we need to look into and recommend to include.
Yeah, because we are talking a lot of coupling water quality models to these hydrological models, which look at the depths of the lakes information and so on. However, we don't still have the physical information as input in these models, right? Yeah. So, which is the surface information is not even that complicated within the water body. And so I think there is a long way to go, right? So
that follows in with Rosie's work too, right? When she starts deploying all the instruments and stuff like that, that would be really helpful for our site to, start including all that within, have the observational data and then start modeling everything for our area.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned the satellite observations coupling, so I think that's also another way to go. However, you showed the grids, but grids of models and having satellite with different pixel size versus the larger grid size of the model. So there might be some issues there, but I'm sure we're going there. Awesome. So we have one more question, Dr. Brown. If you want to include lake connectivity, do you think there is an advantage to gridded models with topography included versus semi-distributed models, or pros or cons to both? That's a long question. Go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Hi, Dr. Brown. I want to include lake connectivity. Yeah, there definitely is pros and cons. The more cons for the gridded models, you do run into areas, with grids and such overlapping and covering, lakes and stuff. Whereas with a semi-distributed model, at least you can include areas, the proper connectivity between lakes and stuff like that. So that's be more advantageous to go that route with the semi-distributed or using TINs even to make sure you can get the lake connectivity over grids at least.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. So if you have, for our audience, if you have questions from any other presentations that we have, and if we have the speakers here, please go ahead. So we have a bit of time for the discussion. So I think if not, we will move on. We are a bit early, but we can move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Rob. Great work, great presentation and discussion. Thank you very much. Awesome. Our last presentation is by Taylor Harrington. Taylor will talk about investigating the impact of snow cover on permafrost soil temperatures in modern reanalysis and data assimilation systems. Taylor, over to you. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Alma, for introducing the presentation. I'm a PhD student at the University of Waterloo, working under Dr. Chris Fletcher. And I'm also working with Dr. Andre Erler at Aquanti as part of the Canada One Water project. So essentially, I'll be looking at, as Homa said, whether or not reanalysis products can capture Arctic soil temperatures, and then as a second part of the project, does snow cover have an impact on these products? Sorry, one sec here. There we go. So just a little bit of a background. In situ soil temperature measurements are spatially sparse and temporarily inconsistent across space and time, which means that it's difficult to get a reasonable assessment of the Pan-Arctic soil temperature distribution. And so we either have to go with reanalysis products or models. The one advantage with reanalysis products is they tend to be a little bit finer resolution than coarse climate models. And so we wanted to look in to see whether or not reanalysis products could be used for this purpose. Previous work in the middle latitudes, looking at, for example, China, Europe, and I guess the Himalayas, found that many of these products unfortunately show relatively large cold bias and RMSEs across the extratropical northern hemisphere. So we were wondering whether or not we could use a blended ensemble approach where we take a bunch of different products and take the ensemble mean of all the products to come up with a better estimate that might be able to reduce some of these biases. Such an approach has been used successfully to reduce biases in snow water equivalents, for example, as well as precipitation and soil moisture, I believe. So the two main questions that I've been looking at are, could a blended ensemble approach be applied to looking at reanalysis estimates of Arctic soil temperatures and therefore be used to improve some of the biases that we're seeing? And then the second follow-up question that we're looking at now, and I'll briefly touch on at the end, is how does snow cover impact the reanalysis soil temperature performance? So just a brief overview. We have data from a bunch of different sites across North America and Eurasia. And in order to be able to come up with a way to take this observational data and make it a little bit more similar to the way that it's structured in reanalysis products, is we calculate a layer average of all the soil temperatures at each station. For example, from the top 30 centimeters, which we're going to refer to as the near surface from here on in, and all soil temperatures between 30 centimeters and 300 centimeters, which we'll refer to as the depth soil measurements. For model or for grid cells with a whole bunch of different stations, we spatially average the values to get one singular grid cell estimate. We use 8 different reanalysis products, and they have quite a range of spatial resolutions, ranging between 0.1 degrees in aerified land, all the way up to 1 degree with the 2G LDAS products. And they have quite a range in terms of vertical resolutions, all the way from the simplest model, which averages soil temperature across a singular layer, JRA 55, to the more complex MERA 2, which has 6 soil layers that go down to somewhere near 10 meters, for example. And what we do is then we take an ensemble mean, or a simple average of all these soil temperatures from across the 8 products, and we see whether or not the ensemble mean soil temperature performs better. And in some early preliminary work, we found that there was quite a large difference in the performance of the reanalysis products in the winter as opposed to the summer. So we've also gone ahead and partitioned our results into a cold season and a warm season, and we'll be looking at those separately. I just have time today to focus on the Pan-Arctic results. I'll mention a paper at the end which goes into much more detail about permafrost zone versus sites outside the permafrost, but here we're just going to focus on the Pan-Arctic scale results. And what do we find? So we find that most products are biased somewhere between about 2 to 8 degrees Celsius roughly. And we notice that generally speaking, the near surface biases are largest in the cold season, or the blue values basically. If we look at JRA 55, it's a little bit of an anomaly here because it only has a singular soil layer, and the singular soil layer is actually more representative of the deep soil layers. We actually find that the biases are largest in the warm season because it underestimates the seasonal cycle of soil temperatures, and as a result seems to get that seasonal cycle wrong. But what I want to point out here is that if we look at the 8 products individually and then look at the ensemble mean, it looks like the biases on average are generally better than or as good as the best performing product at both depths and across both seasons. So that's bias in RMSE. We also wanted to consider correlation and standard deviation. So you may not have seen a plot like this before. It's known as a Taylor diagram. And what it does is it tells us about correlation as well as normalized standard deviation, both at the same time, to give us an assessment basically of how well these models perform relative to the stations. If we look at the warm season, so the panels on the right-hand side here, we see that most of the dots basically line up, somewhere between 0.95 and 0.99. So they have really high correlations with the soil temperatures in the warm season. But if we look at the cold season, the correlations are not only smaller, somewhere between 0.6 and 0.8, but there seems to be greater disagreement between the correlations. And then looking at the standard deviation along the bottom axis, most of the products seem to agree relatively well with the observed variability in the warm season soil temperatures. But then when we look at the cold season, there's a real range, going from about half the seasonal variability in the station data, somewhere close to 2 in some products. And over half the models seem to overestimate the standard deviation relative to the stations. But if we take a look at the ensemble mean product, which we have in pink here, and I've highlighted with a dot, we notice that across all station, or basically across all seasons and depths, the standard deviation is relatively close to this 1.0 line. So that means it's, relatively close to the observed standard deviation. But not only that, but if you look at it with respect to the correlation, it seems like it either performs as good or in many cases better than any of the individual products in terms of correlation. And this suggests that, between the bias, the RMSE, the correlation, and the standard deviation, we have some evidence to suggest that using an ensemble mean approach to reanalysis soil temperatures seems to potentially improve the performance relative to any of the individual products. So this is kind of the main results from paper 1. And now, because we found that the cold season results seem to show much greater variability, greater biases, greater disagreement, we're wondering what it is that is actually causing the cold season results to behave differently than the warm season. So what we wanted to do was just briefly take a look at the soil air temperature relationship across these different products when the ground is snow covered relative to when there's no snow cover. And it seems to be that when we take a look at the soil air temperature relationship on a scatter plot, there's much greater variability in the soil air temperature relationship when the ground is snow covered, i.e. the blue dots, relative to the cases when the ground is not snow covered. And it seems to be that for most of the products, save for JRA 55, which doesn't seem to perform very well at all, there generally tends to be, not surprisingly, a linear relationship between soil and air temperature, but that's not necessarily the case. There's just too much scatter going on when the ground's snow covered. So could snow cover be reducing the coupling between air and soil temperature is kind of the question that we're examining here. And, is this scatter potentially being able to account for the greater spread that we see in the performance of the products over the cold season? So that's kind of the main focus of today's talk. And I think we should have plenty of time for questions. So at this point, I'd like to just mention this is a paper we have in the Cryosphere under review, which goes into much more detail, including the permafrost, no permafrost results, and a few other things. And there's my contact information if you'd like to contact me with any questions. So I think that's it for me. Welcome to answer any questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Great talk, very interesting topic and important work. So we do have lots of time, as Taylor mentioned. So for question and discussion, please ask the question with raising your hand or using the chat. So Taylor, I was looking at air temperature versus surface temperature a long time ago using satellite data, thermal band. And I also have found that when you compare winter versus summer or ice on versus ice off time, there is huge differences, and winter is more less accurate or less agrees with the scatter plot, that example that you're showing. Yeah. So I was thinking at that time that the variability of temperature over winter time could affect it. And it was a passion project for me, so I didn't really get into it much more. So it just reminded me of that passion project at that time. So why do you think that winter has less actually accuracy and more scattered when you compare it with air temperature? I assume it's 2 meter air temperature, right?
Yeah, so here we're showing soil temperature on this column, or this axis, and air temperature on that axis. So our hypothesis is that when snow is present, it's acting as a mechanism that decouples the air temperature from the soil below. So for example, when you might have a little bit of snow cover, for example, it's not really impacting the temperature as much, but when you get 10, 20 centimeters of snow on the soil, it's basically acting as an insulating layer that's now, as the air temperature starts to fluctuate, it's not really causing any great degree in fluctuation in the soil temperature below. So our hypothesis is that, the snow insulation basically factor could potentially maybe be accounting for some of the spread we're seeing in the products. And our hypothesis is that, each of these products, has different physics and different parameterizations. And so our thought is that could differences in the strength of the snow insulation during winter when snow is present potentially account for some of this spread we're seeing and disagreement.
Great. We have two more questions right now. So the first question from Vincent, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Tyler. Thanks for the presentation. My question is really following the present conversation. What are your thoughts in terms of what will be the further step in your analysis to be able to better understand this relationship, the impact of the snow cover and its representation in different reanalysis, because there are a lot of different variability that you will have to take into account, I guess, the snow depth.
Absolutely.
How the snow density is impacting the thermal conductivity of the snowpack, and also even the snow cover fraction among the models. So what would be your strategy to be able to maybe identify the main drivers responsible for these differences? Thanks.
Yeah, so this is actually a very good question, and that's something we're still working out. One of the lines of inquiry that I've been investigating lately is to come up with kind of a metric to estimate the snow insulation factor for these different products. For example, there was a paper by Burke et al. In 2020 that looked at something called the effective snow depth and used that as a metric to estimate basically the ability of the model to insulate the soil from the air temperature above when snow is present. And what they did is they looked at the mean annual ground temperature versus the mean annual air temperature offset. So, if one model has a weak snow insulation factor, one would think that ground temperature, air temperature offset would be quite small. What if the model has a really strong snow insulation factor? One would think that you'd have a really large disagreement between the winter air temperature and the soil temperature. So we wanted to use a similar approach to Burke et al. And look at this effective snow depth or some other metric to estimate how strong is the snow insulation going to be. And that's one line of inquiry we're looking into now, but I don't have any results as of yet to share today, unfortunately. But yeah, you brought up a lot of good points, and this is something we're still thinking about at this time.
Thanks a lot.
Frederick have a similar type of question. I think you covered that already. We have another question from Vanessa. So interesting analysis. Thank you for your presentation. I make measurement of soil temperature and air temperature in isolated permafrost in northern BC. And I found my soil temperatures on permafrost have no relationship with air temperature at all, regardless of season, because of the PF is heavily controlled by the vegetation.
That's a very good point, yeah.
Is this something being considered in the model similar to snow cover effect?
Yeah, so many of these products do have vegetation. Now, the vegetation that they have is highly simplistic, and they usually use something called a plant functional type, similar to what's used in climate models. And it basically just considers, is it boreal forest, is it tundra, but it doesn't get into any of the, the variability that you might see amongst different trees. It just sort of puts one blanket vegetation type across a grid cell and says, this grid cell is tundra, this grid cell is boreal forest. And so, that's a very good point. Often these reanalysis products don't do a great job at, capturing vegetation correctly. And, that's another line of inquiry that, we do want to look into, because I do believe that, vegetation is going to be a definite influence on this.
Awesome. We have one more question from Vincent. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Another question, Tyler. I've seen you showed a map at the beginning of or maybe in the middle of your presentation to show the network of stations that you're using to evaluate. And we can see that like in Canada, the density of station is not really high. I think if we remove Alaska, there are only maybe 10 stations in Canada. Could you comment, like from a perspective, like from the community, like what's the challenge? Are the data missing, or are they scattered around multiple data providers and collectors that make them very challenging to use for the academic? It's more like from a community point of view. Could you comment?
Absolutely. So I did try to do a lot of digging. I looked at the global permafrost network. I looked at I think there's a group out of northern Quebec. I forget what it's called. So we looked at a whole bunch of different sparse permafrost networks, and it just seems to be that unfortunately in Canada, a lot of the soil temperature data is produced for very specific purposes. A lot of it being in the Yukon or the NWT. And what we did is we only looked at sites that had at least 2 years of data. Many of the sites in the Northwest Territories that we were able to find, and there were not that many, didn't meet our 2 years of data basically. And it just seems to be that unfortunately there just seems to be an issue finding data, getting any accessible data for many of these parts of NWT. I basically looked in the literature to see what others were using, and I found a couple other papers had a similar issue, and finding lots of data in Alaska and the Yukon, some in northern Quebec and Ellesmere, Baffin and Ellesmere, but just weren't able to find any substantial amount of sites in the Northwest Territories. Russia has a much longer record of permafrost, I found. So I was able to much more easily get data from Eurasia than I was North America.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we are right on time. Great discussion, great presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers for your great contribution to the session. Lots of question discussion, so really appreciate it. And thanks for the speakers to keep the time, and the audience for the great contribution and questions. So I think here we are closing the monitoring and modeling cryospheric change session. Thank you all also to the conference organizations for the great work. So now this session will be switched to in situ measurement of snow and soil precipitation. So